pointer. That way I'm not going to constantly be turning around. I'll just hit you on the shoulder. Okay. In looking through the records, the historical records, trying to find when is our earliest image of Harmony Hall, Fort Bowman. Here it is in 1809 on the Charles Varley map. We see Belgrove up here as well. And these things, these spurs, are mills. And you can see they're all over the place. Of course, this is Cedar Creek following the mills. And then this is the Valley Pike going down to Strasburg. Next. This is the earliest photograph that we were able to find. This is in 1925. It's in John Whalen's book of architecture of the Shenandoah Valley. And you can see that, for those of you who've been to Harmony Hall, it looks very much the same except for this porch. It has this three-bay, hip-roofed porch that's no longer there. People always want to know, how old is it? That's the first thing, and they very often get fixated about the age. And when we're talking about 18th century houses, sometimes giving or taking, 5-10 years, unless you do dendrochronology, you cannot be certain of exactly when it was constructed. You don't know how long it took. Also, do you go with the beginning construction date or the end construction date? However, as Susie said, traditionally 1753 has been assigned to the house fairly early on in its history. And the records don't dispute the fact that someone was living there at that time or even earlier. And in fact, this photograph shows a building here in the back that is no longer standing. What is there now is a foundation, and perhaps that may have been an earlier structure, or maybe there was another log building on the site until this house was constructed. Here we have Harmony Hall, and here we have Indian Spring, or Christmas Spring, which is just up the road. And I had, when I looked at Fort Bowman, I thought, I've looked at this house before. And then I realized, oh yes, this reminds me so much of Indian Spring, which was built by George Bowman's brother-in-law, Jacob Chrisman, who was son-in-law of Hite. And the two buildings are remarkably similar. And Indian Spring is just headed up on the Valley Pike, near the scales on 81, but it's on the east side of Route 11. It has been, it was remodeled in the Greek Revival style, but still there are some similarities. So I went over to the house, and there it is now. And it does look a lot like Fort Bowman. It does have new window surrounds and a Greek Revival front porch. But in the backyard is this building, which I think is, and others, think is the original house. And I'm fairly certain, and I went in it, very low ceilings. It's obviously a domestic building, and it could very well be that that was the original house, and probably the same thing occurred at Fort Bowman. Next. The great thing about this house is it has a date stone. We like that. We architectural historians like that. And that says 1751. I know that looks like a 7, but it's a 1. And so that is the known date for that house. Go to the next. Then I went up into the attic. And to the left is the attic at Fort Bowman. And it has this very unusual sort of overamped timber framing. And sure enough, in Indian Spring, it's very similar. The only difference is here there's a gap, whereas here this beam rests directly on that. I don't necessarily think they were the same builders who built it, but it's definitely the same tradition. So in looking, again, this was not a historic structures report, this was just a basic history, but this sort of confirmed that, in all probability, it is around 1753. Okay, next. So we have this photo from the left from 1925. Then the photo to the right is from 1935, and Susie mentioned this brochure that she found, I believe, at the Virginia Historical Society. And before Irvin died and I spoke with him, he had told me about the front porch at Fort Bowman, which is a Greek Revival style porch. We know that's not the original porch, and it really has nothing to do with the architecture of the house, and just didn't look like something you would find in this area. But at first I thought it was his father who had put that porch on, and then he said no, it was there when the family had gotten it. It came from a house in Richmond, he thought belonging to the Cable family. Cabell. Well, Susie did some remarkable research, and using city directories found out that the daughter of the Whartons was living in the same apartment building, the Chesterfield Apartments, as James Branch Cabell, and that there was a house. She talked to a historian on Cabell who had documented the houses where he'd lived, and there was this one house that they couldn't find a photo of that's now been demolished, but we think that that is probably where that porch came from, was from that house. Next. This is a component of this study was also doing some oral history, and I talked to Kathleen Robeson, who lived here in the 1940s, and she had, I went to visit her in Falls Church, and then she came out here and she started producing these photographs, and I know she'd given some to Elizabeth before, but she went digging some more, and we found some great things, and so I'm going to share some of those with you. These are from the 40s. This is the front porch. Next. This is, we can see the side of the house, and we can see the rear wing that's there. Here it is covered in its original weatherboard. Next. This is taken in 1954. The cake proves that, unless it's love the dating, you know. And this, if you read the report, this is the famous Emma B. Rhodes, and this is her birthday. And this is on the, would be on the east side of the house. And that seemed, in looking through all these photos, and I'm only sharing a few of them, that seemed to be the side of the house where they would have their outdoor parties and things like that. Next. These photographs, I don't know, it's, you know, everybody had to pose with the two horses, but thank goodness they did. This is on the west side of the house. Here we see that rear wing, and then these, you can see the outbuildings that appear here. And I know Clarence Geyer, who's done some archaeological investigations, had identified some buildings there, but through some of these photographs, we're able to see some of the outbuildings. Next. And that horse and the chickens there, and the little tractor shed, and Kathleen was able to identify exactly where these buildings were.